I have spent a lifetime studying balance sheets, incentives, and human behavior. And if you do that long enough, you stop being surprised by greed. What still surprises me is how often a whole society can be stripped in plain sight, while people are told it is merely efficiency. A factory closes, and that is called discipline. A hospital cuts staff, and that is called optimization. A family is priced out of a neighborhood, and that is called market clearing. A young person gives up on ownership and is told flexibility is freedom. I have heard many elegant phrases in finance. Very few of them are honest. When I look at what has happened to younger Americans, I do not see a string of unrelated disappointments. I see one long pattern. I see jobs turned fragile, homes turned into yield, health turned into margin, food turned into extraction, and the future turned into a subscription. I see a generation entering adulthood in the most expensive housing market of its life, under a cost of living burden it did not design, while the job ladder beneath it has been sawed off one rung at a time. People will tell you these are separate headlines. They are not. They are connected by the same logic. The language changes with a decade, but the behavior does not. In the 1980s, the people doing this sort of work were often called barbarians at the gate. That title sounds, but it was useful because it described the act clearly. They were not arriving to cultivate a business. They were arriving to take control of it with borrowed money, force the company itself to carry the debt, cut what could be cut, sell what could be sold, and pull cash back out as quickly as possible. If the structure held together long enough, the financiers won. The damage stayed with the workers, the suppliers, the pensioners, the towns, and eventually the taxpayer. That is the heart of the leveraged buyout. It is one of the clearest examples in finance of how language can sanitize reality. A person sees a business worth $100. He does not wish to use $100 of his own money. He may put up 10, he borrows the other 90. Then, with a bit of legal engineering and financial confidence, the debt sits not on his shoulders, but on the shoulders of the company he has just purchased. Suddenly, the business has to serve two masters. It has to remain alive as a real enterprise, and it has to satisfy a debt burden that was imposed on it to finance its own capture. If there is not enough room for both, reality gives way first. Assets get sold, workers get dismissed, maintenance gets delayed, quality falls. The business may appear leaner on paper for a while. Then, if markets are generous, the owner may borrow again and pay himself through a recapitalization, taking cash off the table while the operating company is loaded with still more obligations. Profits stay private. Losses spread outward into the community, like a spill in a river. I am not offended by leverage in every form. Used with care, debt can help build things that deserve to exist. Railroads were not financed by piggy banks. Utilities were not built with spare change. But debt attached to productive assets is one thing. Debt attached to extraction is another. Debt that expands capacity can be useful. Debt that merely allows one class of owners to remove value faster than it was created is a different animal. Once you learn to distinguish those two, much of modern economic life becomes easier to understand. This machine did not stay confined to a few colorful raiders in Manhattan. It scaled, regulations shifted, the tax code treated corporate debt kindly. Junk bonds expanded the financing pool. Then the industry rebranded itself. Corporate raider is a phrase that embarrasses dinner guests. Private equity sounds like a profession. The words grew softer as the consequences grew larger. The funding model also changed. Instead of relying mainly on the partner's own money, firms raised gigantic pools from pension funds, university endowments, and other institutions that represent the savings and promises of ordinary people. In other words, the risk widened even as accountability narrowed. The capital became public in origin, but the rewards remained private in destination. This is one of the oldest tricks in markets. If I can enjoy the upside personally while distributing the downside socially, I have every incentive to keep enlarging the game. That is why the scale matters. When the biggest firms control asset bases larger than the economies of many nations, they are no longer just selecting investments. They are shaping the cost structure of everyday life. They can alter how much it costs to rent, how much care a hospital has available, how many jobs remain in a small town, whether an elderly resident can afford a lot fee in a manufactured housing park, and whether a young worker sees adulthood as a path toward ownership or a long hallway of recurring payments. People sometimes speak as if the suffering of younger generations arose out of thin air. I do not believe that. I think much of it was designed through incentives. Consider the job market first. Gen Z is often told it lacks grit. I find that accusation lazy. The same economy making that accusation has removed an enormous number of the jobs that used to anchor early adult life. Retail, consumer businesses, entry-level service work, local employment ladders, and lower-margin manufacturing have all been treated as inputs in financial engineering. A business bought with too much debt does not need to be evil to become cruel. It merely needs to be unable to breathe. The quickest route to breathing room is usually wage pressure, fewer workers, fewer hours, fewer benefits, deferred maintenance, and sales of anything not nailed down. Then people look at the ruins and say the workers should have adapted. One of the most famous corporate ghosts in America is Toys R Us. What was presented to the public as changing consumer behavior was also, in very meaningful part, the story of a company loaded with debt, and then expected to perform under an absurd burden. Tens of thousands of workers paid the real price. It is easy to discuss that example as history, but history matters because it teaches a habit. Once a system learns it can saddle a company, drain it, and walk away while the social cost is absorbed elsewhere, it repeats itself. That is not an accident. It is a business model. The effect on wages is not abstract. When a takeover structure is built around extraction, labor becomes a variable to be reduced, not a capability to be developed. That is how a generation already battling underemployment, weak entry ladders, and rising living costs gets shoved toward even more fragile ground. The cruel irony is that younger workers are then told to be flexible precisely because the stable platforms that once taught flexibility have been gutted. Housing is where the damage becomes impossible to romanticize. If a country faces a shortage of homes, a shortage of affordable rental units, and declining first-time homeownership among the young, any serious policy mind should see shelter as a social need. Instead, finance increasingly sees it as an income stream with excellent enforcement. Food can be skipped for a while, a vacation can be canceled, a subscription can be paused. Shelter is different. Rent is one of the purest toll booths in economic life because failure to pay has immediate and visible consequences. When you blend that reality with institutional capital hungry for yield, you create a machine that sees homes less as places where people build lives and more as boxes that throw off monthly cash. That is why I pay attention when entire communities are built not mainly to be sold into ownership, but to be held for rent. There is a meaningful difference between building homes to house people and building neighborhoods to harvest payments. The asset can look identical from the street. The social function is not the same. A young family trying to buy into stability meets not just another household at the open house, but a balance sheet. The same logic descends into manufactured housing, which for decades was one of the last remaining islands of modest affordability for people with limited means. If you want a crisp lesson in power, watch what happens when financial ownership enters a market where the residents often own the structure sitting on the land but not the land beneath it. The moving costs are punishing, the alternatives are scarce, the residents are captive. That is a perfect setup for rent extraction. And once that door opens, every monthly increase becomes less about value and more about leverage. You do not need a lecture in microeconomics to understand what that does to a retiree, a working parent, or a young adult trying to start a life. You only need to imagine what it feels like when home is no longer a refuge from the market, but the most efficient meter the market has ever installed. By the time many members of Gen Z reach 30, they may have handed over staggering sums in rent and still own none of the underlying asset. That fact matters financially, but it matters psychologically too. Ownership is not just a line item. Ownership teaches time preference. Ownership changes how you maintain something, how you plan, how you endure a bad month, how you imagine a decade. A society that steadily blocks younger people from owning productive or stabilizing assets is not merely making them poorer. It is training them into a different relationship with the future. Healthcare may be even more disturbing because here the commodity being optimized is not shelter, but human vulnerability itself. I have long believed that systems reveal their true ethics under stress. A hospital, nursing home, behavioral health network, ambulance service, or staffing pipeline exists in an arena where delay, understaffing, and thin margins are not theoretical inconveniences. They change outcomes. If you load such systems with debt, cut labor, and prioritize margin extraction, you are not just editing a spreadsheet. You are editing a human survival environment. Research linking private ownership structures in healthcare to higher mortality, Worse infection rates, more falls, thinner staffing, and lower care quality is not an interesting side note. It is the point. Healthcare is one of the clearest places where the ideology of minimization collides with reality. There is a limit to how much you can shave from a life or death system before it stops being a hospital in the moral sense and becomes merely a billing architecture with beds. Younger people feel this differently than the elderly, but they feel it too. Rising costs push them to skip care. Delayed care becomes worsened care. Worsened care becomes less stable work, worse financial resilience, and deeper dependence. When a system makes medicine harder to access at the same time the labor market is becoming more precarious, it compounds fragility on both sides. Food and agriculture reveal a quieter version of the same pattern. Americans rarely think of farms, meat packers, and animal welfare in the same mental frame as housing finance or hospital staffing. But the connective tissue is obvious if you look at incentives. Concentration creates pricing power. Debt creates pressure. Pressure invites shortcuts. Family operations weaken. Larger processors strengthen. Animals are packed into harsher systems. And the cultural promise of stewardship gives way to the logic of extraction. People see higher grocery bills and think mostly about inflation. Underneath, there may also be a story about who owns the system, how much debt it carries, what margins are demanded, and which living things are treated as mere throughput. I do not mention animal welfare as an ornament. A society willing to industrialize cruelty because it is profitable should not be shocked when the same logic appears in labor markets, housing, and healthcare. Extraction rarely stays confined to one category. Once the habit forms, it migrates. Then there is private credit, which to my mind is one of the most important chapters in this whole drama because it shows how systems evolve after the first extraction model becomes familiar. Private equity loads a company with debt. When that debt needs refinancing and traditional banks are more cautious or less able to provide it, an adjacent market steps forward. Loans are made outside the old banking channels by private funds, asset managers, and specialized lenders. The pitch is always familiar. It is flexible. It is efficient. It fills a market need. Some of that is true. But a thing can serve a market need and still become dangerous when scale, opacity, and optimism outrun discipline. A private credit market measured in the trillions should make any thoughtful investor sit up straight. I do not say that because I think every loan is bad. I say it because when a lightly supervised shadow structure grows massive, extends credit to already leveraged businesses, leans on rosy future assumptions, and operates away from the most traditional forms of scrutiny, you have created the kindling for a future fire. It may not ignite tomorrow. Fires rarely care about our convenience, but the material is there. The most dangerous bubbles are often circular. One part of the system creates the debt. Another part refinances it. A third part packages the optimism. Everyone collects fees along the way. Meanwhile, the underlying businesses must somehow produce enough cash in the real economy to support the whole construction. If they cannot, someone will eventually discover that liquidity was assumed, valuations were flattered, and confidence was standing in for resilience. That is how shadow finance turns from a clever supplement into a systemic question. When a fund has to limit withdrawals because redemptions exceed available liquidity, I do not immediately declare apocalypse. Panic is not analysis. But I do pay attention because liquidity gates are the market's way of reminding investors that an asset written down slowly can still be illiquid all at once. Confidence can vanish faster than a model updates. Now, put all of this together from the perspective of someone in Gen Z. Jobs are weaker. Housing is dearer. Healthcare is more expensive and thinner. Food systems are more concentrated. Debt structures have multiplied behind the scenes. Private credit sits outside many of the old guardrails. The national balance sheet is already stressed. Geopolitical conflict adds uncertainty. Technology threatens white-collar stability at the same time other industries remain brittle. Then older commentators ask why the young feel anxious. That is not analysis. That is mockery dressed as wisdom. I understand why many young people feel as if the nation has been converted into a shell company. The metaphor is not perfect, but it is illuminating. In a classic shell game, what matters is not building enduring value but controlling pathways, moving obligations, and leaving substance somewhere. The crowd cannot find it until it is too late. A country can be treated similarly. Public assets are sold. Housing is financialized. Work becomes more contingent. Healthcare becomes more extractive. Education becomes more debt-laden. Infrastructure is postponed. Then, when the strain shows, people are told the market is merely signaling what is efficient. That is a convenient doctrine when you are upstream from the pain. There is another part of this story that offends me deeply. Many of the pools of money funding these processes came from people who believed they were securing retirements, endowments, or long-term public obligations. Pension money is sacred money in a moral sense. It represents years of life already spent. When that capital is fed into structures that can vaporize value, liquidate livelihoods, and enrich intermediaries, the betrayal is larger than a bad investment. It is an abuse of trust. I have seen stories of pension balances and livelihoods wrecked while the architects of the structure moved on to the next opportunity. I have seen what happens when residents in manufactured housing communities face rent hikes that sound modest on a conference call but feel catastrophic at a kitchen table. I have seen how an increase of a few $100s in the wrong household is not a budget adjustment but a psychological event. Finance people often underestimate this because they look at percentages. Life is lived in absolutes. A household does not experience an extra $200 as a ratio. It experiences it as one more fracture in a month, already packed with fractures. Now, I also want to be careful. It is easy to let anger harden into fatalism. I do not believe fatalism is wise, and I do not believe it is useful. A person can stare at corruption until he starts using corruption as an excuse for his own absence from life. That is a second defeat, and it comes gift-wrapped as sophistication. A young person may reasonably say, "The game is rigged." Often some part of it is, but the sentence becomes poisonous when it turns into permission not to build discipline, not to learn, not to cooperate, not to care, not to show up. The larger system may be ugly. That does not relieve the individual of the duty to remain alive inside his own life. One of the hardest truths I learned in markets is that scale and compounding work at every level. They work in debt, and they work in conduct. A nation can be damaged by the compounding effect of leverage and extraction. A neighborhood can be strengthened by the compounding effect of responsibility and example. That may sound small beside private equity, but scale is built from repetition. The habit of ignoring a piece of trash, a dirty table, a displaced mat, or an unattended obligation is not private equity. It is not Washington. It is not a hedge fund. It is a local failure of care. And if a people cannot maintain the little civilization around them, they should not flatter themselves that they are ready to reclaim the larger one. I do not say that to trivialize structural abuse. I say it because moral seriousness begins where your hands are. If you want to challenge a culture that prices everything and reveres nothing, you begin by doing unrewarded things well. You push in the chair, you pick up the trash, you return the shopping cart, you show up on time, you clean what you use, you keep your promises, you protect the vulnerable person in front of you, you resist the seduction of becoming as careless as the system you criticize. That is not the whole answer, but it is the beginning of one. Markets train people to watch the largest numbers. Life is often repaired through the smallest repeated acts. I have seen businesses transformed not by a heroic speech, but by the daily example of one manager who refused to tolerate sloppiness, humiliation, or indifference. Culture is not mainly what a company prints on a brochure. Culture is what becomes normal in the room. The same applies to a country. If exploitation becomes normal at the top and apathy becomes normal at the bottom, decline accelerates from both directions. That is why I resist two temptations at once. I resist the false optimism that says everything is fundamentally fine because the stock market still functions and the headlines have not yet turned apocalyptic. I also resist the dramatic despair that says collapse is certain and nothing is worth doing. Both positions allow a person to avoid the more difficult work of seeing clearly and acting locally while preparing prudently. Will there be serious economic trouble ahead? I think the odds are too high for comfort. When you can reach into a hat and draw out one warning after another: housing strain, labor fragility, auto stress, private equity bankruptcies, private credit opacity, public debt burdens, geopolitical risk, infrastructure weakness, and healthcare strain. You are not imagining smoke, but recognizing smoke is different from choosing paralysis. An investor who sees risk does not burn his records, curse the sky, and stop showing up. He strengthens his balance sheet. He studies incentives. He avoids needless debt. He protects optionality. He becomes harder to kill financially. He helps the people near him do the same when he can. For a young person, that may sound unfair because it is unfair. Why should the burden of prudence fall on the very people inheriting the damage? It should not. But reality is not a courtroom. It does not allocate pain according to moral desert. It allocates pain according to exposure. That is why I would rather tell the young the truth than comfort them with slogans. The truth is that you may have to be wiser earlier than previous generations had to be. You may have to think about ownership, debt, rent, skills, savings, health, and community with a seriousness that should not have been demanded of you this soon. That is not your fault. It may still be your task. I also think it is essential to understand the psychology of those driving the extraction. People ask, why would anyone keep hollowing out a society that made them rich? The answer is simpler than they expect. Incentives plus distance. If I believe I will keep the gains, externalize the damage, secure a bailout if things go badly, move my capital, and live comfortably no matter how the median citizen fares, then why would I stop? A person does not need to wake up each day twirling a villain's mustache. He needs only to keep responding rationally to a system that rewards him for moral numbness. That is why I do not like conversations that pretend institutions act on their own. Institutions are run by people. The spreadsheet does not feel empathy. The executive deciding where to cut it away does. The fund structure does not prefer profit over care. The people inside it do, or they allow it to happen. The worst financial systems are often built not by monsters, but by well-compensated cowards. People who would never personally describe themselves as cruel, yet keep signing the papers that turn cruelty into a process. A nation can survive a great many mistakes. What it struggles to survive is an elite consensus that every sphere of life should be optimized for extraction. Once that idea sinks deep enough, even things that once stood outside finance become targets. Homes, hospitals, farms, local media, infrastructure, and now data centers and new credit structures all get pulled into the same logic. If it can borrow, it can be levered. If it can charge monthly, it can be securitized. If it can be made essential, it can be monetized. If it can be hidden in a complex structure, someone will call it sophisticated. The saddest part is not merely that the country becomes more expensive. It is that it becomes spiritually thinner. People stop expecting stewardship. They stop believing anyone in authority means what he says. They assume every service has a hidden fee, every institution has a hidden owner, every political promise has a sponsor, every recommendation has an affiliate relationship, every neighborhood will be repriced, every platform will sell them back their own attention, every hospital will bill them like an adversary, every job will vanish the moment a spreadsheet prefers it. So, cynicism becomes adaptive. A society living in that emotional register is hard to govern well, because trust is one of the first infrastructures to decay. And yet trust can also be rebuilt in the other direction. I have seen that too. It does not happen quickly. It happens through visible reliability. The person who keeps the place orderly without applause. The manager who protects his workers when margins are under pressure. The landlord who refuses opportunistic increases because he remembers tenants are families, not yield instruments. The doctor who pushes back on impossible staffing. The local business owner who keeps quality high when cutting corners would be profitable. The citizen who resists becoming numb. These people do not dominate headlines, but they keep civilization from collapsing into abstraction. When I was younger, I came to appreciate how much of investing is really the study of incentives over time. As I have grown older, I see that citizenship works the same way. If you reward extraction everywhere, you will get more extraction. If you celebrate ownership without stewardship, you will get predation. If you train a generation to expect only rent, debt, precarity, and subscriptions, do not be surprised when social confidence evaporates. But if you reward durability, competence, decency, local responsibility, and real ownership, compounding begins working for you again. That is the real fight here. It is not only about a category called private equity. It is about whether the country remains something more than a levered claim on its own people. It is about whether work is allowed to lead to ownership, whether ownership is allowed to provide stability, whether stability is allowed to support family formation, whether healthcare is allowed to preserve life rather than strip it, whether food systems are allowed to nourish rather than merely extract, and whether finance is allowed to serve production rather than cannibalize it. I cannot promise a clean ending. There may be a hard period ahead. Some bubbles may burst. Some funds may gate redemptions. Some business models may reveal what they always were. Some young people may enter adult life under conditions that feel insulting to the word opportunity. I see that. But I also know this: a rotten incentive system does not absolve us from building better habits, stronger local cultures, more honest enterprises, and sturdier personal balance sheets. The corruption around us cannot become the excuse for our own collapse. If I were young today, I would not waste energy pretending the system is fair. I would also not waste energy waiting for fairness to arrive before I built discipline. I would learn how debt works. I would learn how ownership works. I would avoid becoming captive to recurring payments wherever I could. I would treat savings not as a lifestyle accessory but as oxygen. I would choose skills that are hard to automate and useful in the real world. I would watch incentives with almost unreasonable intensity. I would not confuse a rising price with a sound structure. I would be careful about institutions that profit when I remain weak. I would be equally careful not to let bitterness make me weak. Most of all, I would remember that hope does not need to be loud to be real. Real hope is not a slogan pasted over decay. It is a discipline. It is the compounded effect of people deciding again and again not to become as careless as the age around them. It is a small ripple that spreads because someone bothered to create it. A chair pushed in, a mat straightened, a mess cleaned, a promise kept, a worker protected, a family helped, a community defended, a business run with honor, a balance sheet built with caution. A young person refusing to accept that his only role in the economy is to make monthly payments until he dies. That last point matters to me more than any headline statistic. A free society cannot endure if its young conclude that life consists of renting everything, financing the rest, and absorbing whatever new fee structure arrives next quarter. People need a path toward dignity that is not purely rented from institutions. They need something to build, something to own, something to pass on, and some reason to believe restraint and responsibility still lead somewhere worth going. I do not think the country is healed by one speech, one law, one election, or one market cycle. It is healed, if it is healed at all, when enough people reject the assumption that endless extraction is normal. It is healed when capital is once again expected to serve life rather than consume it. It is healed when the young are offered more than subscriptions, when shelter is once again understood as shelter, when medicine is once again understood as care, when food is once again understood as nourishment, when work is once again allowed to accumulate into ownership, and when a balance sheet is judged not only by what it extracts this quarter, but by what it leaves standing for the next generation. That is the standard I would use, not whether the machine can keep running a little longer, not whether another layer of debt can refinance the previous layer, not whether a fund can squeeze one more distribution out of a captive asset. I would ask something simpler. After the deal is done, after the fees are paid, after the consultants leave, after the slogans fade, is the town stronger? Is the worker safer? Is the patient better cared for? Is the family closer to ownership? Is the farm more humane? Is the young person more hopeful? And is the future more buildable than it was before? If the answer is no often enough, then the system is not investing. It is eating. And a country that permits itself to be eaten should not be surprised when its children look up and wonder why their future feels leased.